Hello, I'm Michael Bunch. I'm the plant pathologist at the North Dakota State University Carrington Research Extension Center. I'd like to take this opportunity to summarize the findings from our research evaluating the impact of fungicide application timing on white mold in pinto beans. I'd like to stress that this research evaluates when you should spray fungicides targeting white mold in pinto beans when conditions favor white mold as you enter bloom. If conditions do not favor white mold as you enter bloom, you should delay that application until weather conditions change. Okay. Again, I'm looking at a different research question. I'm looking at when you should spray when you know that it's cool and wet and you're worried about white mold and those dry beans are entering bloom. Testing was conducted on pinto beans seeded to both narrow and wide rows. Seeding rate was 90,000 viable seeds an acre. Spray volume was 15 gallons an acre. And testing conducted from 2020 to 2022, we did this with a handheld spray boom pressurized by carbon dioxide. Testing conducted in 2024 was conducted with a tractor-mounted PTO-driven sprayer. Okay, fungicide droplet size was calibrated relative to canopy characteristics in 2020 to 2024. Okay, and all those years. And the interval between sequential applications, when we did 2 sequential applications, was 8 to 14 days, depending on the study. Number of experimental replicates was 6, 7, 9, 10, 15, or 16, depending on the study. Okay, typically we always do this research with 8 or more experimental replicates because white mold disease pressure tends to differ across the footprint of a study. And the more experimental replicates you do, the more you even out those differences. The more you increase the odds that every treatment will be exposed to the same number of times to areas of high disease pressure versus low disease pressure. Okay, so standard agronomic research is done with 4 experimental replicates. This is obviously a lot more rigorous than that, and it's because of the inherent challenges of doing white mold research, in that the white mold disease pressure tends to be spatially very inconsistent. Okay, we designed to assess disease by individually scoring individual plants for white mold severity, very close to dry bean maturity. We clipped the plants at the base concurrent with disease assessments and windrowed them to dry down, and then passed the windrowed plants to the combine. This is equivalent to knifing. We did this manual harvest that's equivalent to knifing rather than straight harvest, because by knifing the beans, we made sure that lodging did not obscure our results. We often have differential lodging across the footprint of these studies, and that lodging is independent of disease severity. Okay, and so it's not reflective of the efficacy of the fungicide. When you straight harvest, the lodging becomes a secondary parameter that influences your yield. And in this case, it would have introduced unacceptable noise into our yield data. And so to ensure that our yield data accurately reflect the impact of fungicide application timing, we conducted this research by knifing the beans, windrowing them, drying them down that way, and then passing the windrowed beans through the combine. Irrigation was managed to, supplemental overhead irrigation was applied and managed to ensure that we've got some white mold pressure. So what did we learn? What you can see here is that I've got bar graphs showing the results across 5 studies. These are studies where the canopy was open as the dry beans enter bloom. Okay, the bar graphs show the percent white mold severity, the percent of the canopy diseased with white mold at the end of the season, and the yield, of course, shows the pounds per acre yield on average across those 5 studies. Then on the right, you'll see a scatter plot. That allows you to see the consistency of the response across studies. Okay, each one of those dots is the results from one of the studies. And then the bar gives you the average, and that's the yield gain conferred by that fungicide. What you can see is when we made a single application to an open canopy, we optimized disease management. by waiting until 70 to 85% of plants had initial pin pods. What do I mean by initial pin pods? Well, when the dry bean blossom senesces, it immediately produces this very tiny pin-shaped pod, initially just about a 1/4 inch long. That pin-shaped pod eventually grows into that full-length pod that we harvest. But the moment the dry bean blossom senesces again, you get this pin-shaped pod, and that pin-shaped pod is very easy to assess. Okay, looking for dead blossoms, that's hard. But looking for pin-shaped pods is easy. We go to each of the non-repeating controls across the replicated study, and we go to one arbitrary spot in the plot. We look at 10 plants in a row, look at how many of those have initial pin pods. You can do this in your field as well. Go to the area of the field that you're worried about white mold, look at a minimum 10 spots. In each of those spots, look at 10 plants in a row, see how many have initial pin pods. The percent of plants with initial pin pods equals the percent of plants with dead blossoms. Because white mold only comes in and infects the plants through the dead blossoms, this is a very good indication of the percent of plants that are susceptible to white mold. Okay, and so what you can see is that when we were doing a single fungicide application, we needed to wait until 70 to 85% of plants had initial pin pods, and applying early carried a penalty. Okay, and a very strong penalty. Okay, what about if we did 2 sequential applications? What you can see is that in terms of our average yield, we actually optimize at the same growth stage. In terms of average disease control, maybe just a little bit earlier, but it's very, very similar. Basically, we got very, very similar disease and yield responses when we applied anywhere from 45 to 85% of plants with initial pin pods, which essentially just gave us a little bit more flexibility. And if you look at the distribution of those dots, you can see that results were quite consistent across all the studies for these application timings. So what happens if that dry bean canopy closes earlier? When it closes earlier, it traps humidity in that canopy a lot better and makes it more susceptible to white mold, right? And so basically, when you trap the humidity better, that pathogen is able to infect easier, okay? And so under those conditions, we had 3 studies that we evaluated, and where the canopy was already at or near closure at initial pin pod. And what you can see immediately is that our application timings shifted forward. So if we were going to do a single fungicide application, we optimized at 60 to 80% of plants with initial pin pods, which is similar to what we saw before, but notice the penalty to going on earlier was not nearly as strong. Okay, it was really close, and so thus our optimal application timing shifted forward a bit. Okay, and if we were going to do 2 sequential fungicide applications, now our application timing is at 10 to 20% of plants' initial pin pods. Unequivocally, there's a huge penalty to applying earlier and a huge penalty to applying later. Okay, so conditions are more favorable for white mold. Means you need to spray just a little bit earlier. Okay, the same would be true if you're comparing, conditions where the daytime high was in the upper 80s versus upper 70s. Upper 70s, you need to spray just a little bit earlier than if in the upper 80s. Okay. Okay, so let's summarize what we learned here. What we have learned is that if you're going to do a single fungicide application and conditions favor white mold as you enter bloom, you should make that single application at about 60 to 80% of plants with initial pin pods. And remember, though, that you have some flexibility to go on a bit earlier if conditions are particularly favorable for white mold. That canopy is already closed, or temperatures are daytime highs are only in the upper 70s. Okay, and now if you're going to do 2 sequential fungicide applications, you need to make that application a bit earlier. If conditions are highly favorable for white mold, i.e. closed canopy and or really cool daytime highs, you want to be targeting about 10 to 20% of plants with initial pin pods. If conditions are a little bit less favorable for white mold, you want to wait till 50 to 80% of plants with initial pin pods. So what we have seen is that in these data and these results is that there's a penalty to applying too late. Let's discuss that. This is something that most people understand. Fungicides do not give us, are not able to cure existing infections. Okay, a few of our modern chemistries will give us a little bit of curative activity that can eradicate an infection within 24 hours of the pathogen infecting. But this is only some of the fungicides, and even those perform better when the fungicide is applied prior to infection. But even then, when you get in those handful of fungicides that give you some curative activity, realize that you're looking at still microscopic level of infection at the very early stages of infection, still a good 2 weeks before you'd actually see disease, because there's a gap of about 2, sometimes even 3 weeks between when white mold infects and when you actually see the disease. And the intervening period, the fungus is growing in the plant, but it can't be seen with the eye. You'd have to look at it under the microscope. Okay. So that's why you see a penalty to applying too late, because you got to get the fungicide on before the pathogen infects. Everyone knew that, right? Everyone knows that. Why do we see a penalty to applying too early? You saw this over and over in the data that I showed, okay? And that's because the dry beans are putting on lots of new growth as they're entering bloom, and that new growth is not protected by the fungicide. What you're protecting is you're protecting the canopy that's already there. And any degree to which that fungicide is carried along with the growing point into that new growth, the level, the concentration of the fungicide is not sufficient in that new growth to give you adequate protection. Okay, and so if you spray that fungicide 5 days before the pathogen infects, you've got 5 days of new growth, all of which is highly susceptible to white mold. Okay, if you apply it just 1 day before pathogen infection, then you only have 1 day of new growth, and you can see you're going to get much better disease control out of that fungicide application. Okay, and to illustrate what I mean, let me show you a picture from field peas. Okay, these are field peas that we sprayed with a fungicide targeting powdery mildew at bloom initiation. Okay, and then after we sprayed, the peas kept on growing upward. Okay, it was early in bloom. Okay, and early in the bloom period, well, those peas continue growing upward and putting on more blossoms and more pods higher up, right? At the end of the season, what we see, that bottom part of the canopy that was present when we sprayed the fungicide had excellent powdery mildew management. The peas are clean. The upper part of the canopy that grew after we sprayed the fungicide, it's powdery mildew. Okay, the same thing happens for white mold and dry beans. Okay, it's just a little harder to get a picture of it. Okay, so what you can see now is that we have some challenges. First off, you might have noticed that even with the optimal application timing, we had a lot of disease. 50% control was considered good. It's not very good. All right, and so that's with the optimal application timing. And we just discussed that there's a penalty to applying too early and a penalty to applying too late. And when you get the timing, when the timing isn't perfect, disease control isn't even 50%. Okay, and getting that timing perfect is really hard, because oftentimes one part of the field will be at our optimal growth stage while the other part is not. Okay, because the dry bean growth and development is often not even across a field. Okay, and then every day is not a spray day, right? Some days are too windy. Sometimes the field is too muddy. I mean, some days it's raining, okay? And the dry beans can go from 10% of plants with pin pods to 60% of plants with pin pods in 3 days. Okay, and so it's very hard to get this optimal application timing. All right, and so what do we do about that, right? We can't do anything about the fact that we can't cure existing infections, but we could possibly do something about the fact that that new growth isn't protected, right? So we could maybe buy ourselves some flexibility to spray a bit earlier if we tightened up the interval between applications, such that the new growth was protected a little bit earlier. Okay, in theory, that should give us better white mold management and less of a penalty to applying too early. And again, what we're seeking is a little bit of flexibility on our timing. And so to test that, we started in 2024 a separate set of studies looking at the impact of fungicide application interval, timing, and frequency on white mold management in pinto and kidney beans. And I would recommend you reference that. Okay, because when you tighten up that interval, that second application goes on earlier and no longer and doesn't necessarily protect you to the end of the season anymore. Okay, and so then it might be necessary to do a third application. I will not get into the results of that here. Reference those materials. They're also posted online alongside these results. With that, I'd like to thank my staff, Aaron Faust, Sven Collis, Jesse Haffer, Gabby Henson, very dedicated, hardworking staff who put in very long hours in the field season. It is their dedication that makes this possible. I'd also like to thank my collaborators in Oaks, Heidi and Spencer Esslinger, Leonard Bessman and Kelly Cooper, both of whom have now retired but contributed to this work. I'd also like to thank the funding sponsors, okay? North Harvest Bean Growers Association, the North Dakota Crop Protection Product Harmonization Registration Board, and the USDA Specialty Crop Block Grant Program. These last two agencies administered by the North Dakota Department of Agriculture. It is the funding from the grants from these three agencies that made it possible to pay for the staff salaries and also pay for the supplies needed to do this work. Okay, and the equipment maintenance and upkeep associated with keeping our equipment running so we can do the work, right? But I'd also like to thank the private companies that do contract testing with us, because it is the funding from those companies that has allowed us to purchase a block combine, to purchase the sprayers, to purchase the other equipment, the farm equipment that we need to keep on operating our program. And without their contract testing, we wouldn't have those dollars available to do that. And finally, I'll give my very sincere thanks to Bollingburg Seeds, Green Valley Bean, and Kelly Bean companies for donating the seed for these fungicide timing studies. In this case, the Pinto bean seed was donated by Kurt Bollingburg from Bollingburg Seeds, and I very much appreciate that assistance that helps make this work possible. Thank you very much. Thank you for your time, and I hope this research is of value to your operations.